Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 18, Section 3, Hoover Responds to the Great Depression. So here we go. Number one, when did President Hoover assure the nation that the fundamental business of the country was sound and prosperous? It would be on October 25th, 1929, the day after Black Thursday or the crash of the stock market. What did President Hoover do to devise a strategy for improving the economy? Well, he organized a series of conferences with some of the leaders in big business. I would say this: it didn't necessarily stop the panic that was happening with people, the runs that were happening on the banks and such. So, what did President Hoover increase funding for to replace jobs lost in the private sector? Increase the funding for public works or government finance construction projects. Examples of this would be what you see below, the construction of Boulder Dam. And today we don't refer to it as Boulder Dam, but it's actually known as Hoover's Dam or Hoover Dam, which is out there in Nevada, not very far from the city of Las Vegas. This was one of the biggest construction projects that was happening during the 1930s. And some people attribute this to FDR, but truth be it really began during the Hoover administration. And this was one of those things that brought people to Nevada. Actually, it was probably one of those things responsible for help building the city of Las Vegas in a way, because this is going to be a power source for electricity and such for people living in parts of Nevada and California. But needless to say, a guy who gets a lot of blame for the Depression has this great dam that is named after him. So, what was President Hoover's fear about deficit spending? That's basically spending more money than the government was taking in. He believed that it was only going to delay an economic recovery. And you got to remember, Hoover was a Republican. And Republicans have always been a little leery about deficit spending if they're very true fiscal conservative Republicans. So I would say that, his fears certainly were not unfounded in a sense, because we have had problems with deficit spending here in our country really since the 1930s. So, what was the purpose of the National Credit Corporation, or something known as the NCC? What it was going to do is it was going to ease the money shortages created by the pool of money that banks could loan out. And so the idea was that the government would have an opportunity to help those people who had money in banks that were, for the most part, kind of suffering. Um, Great idea. Didn't necessarily probably do um, the mending to our nation that maybe Hoover thought it would. He also helped create this Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And so, why did this corporation fail? Well, it didn't increase the loans in order to meet those who needed them. In other words, there were probably more people who were in need of a loan or a bailout to keep from losing their property, um, and that the RFC couldn't necessarily meet all their needs. And so we did have people that obviously lost their homes or lost their farms. So, why did President Hoover oppose the federal government's participation in relief programs? He was concerned, and I'm not going to say that he wasn't alone, but there were a lot of politicians out there at this time that were really kind of leery about handing out way too much money or welfare. And he believed that only the states and local governments should provide this relief because they kind of knew the needs of the people probably better than the federal government. In time, when we have an administration change and we elect Franklin Roosevelt, relief, recovery, and reform are going to become kind of the big, I guess you could call themes of his presidency. And occasionally, the relief was probably more in the form of kind of a welfare system that the federal government established, and we still have to this day. Number 8, what was the purpose of the Emergency Relief and Construction Act? This was to provide funds for public works and loans. This idea of building highways, maybe building bridges, we're going to add on to that as we get into the FDR administration, but it kind of gets its beginnings here with Hoover. What caused nearly 1 million farmers to lose their farms between 1930 and 1934? Well, take a guess. The economy was kind of rough, and hence the farm economy was not doing so well. Creditors foreclosed on roughly a million farms in the United States, and as a result of the government foreclosing, uh, they were a lot of families were evicted from these farms. What's kind of interesting, and I'm going to point out this picture below that says penny auction on it. Both of these pictures below were actually photos taken from the state of Nebraska during this period of time. And every so often, when neighbors got wind that maybe one of their fellow farmers was going to lose their farm, uh, they would band together. And when the banks would hold these auctions to auction off all their assets, um, neighbors would gather together and to buy back basically a farm for their fellow farmer by basically bidding just pennies on the dollar. And this was a way that people looked out for one another. It's definitely something that you can be proud of in the Midwest that, neighbors really care for their neighbors. On the other hand, if you take a look at this other photo, it's kind of an interesting photograph here. What's weird is during the 30s, particularly at the beginning, we had a lot of folks that were down on their luck, and food was hard to get hard to get for some folks because of the fact that they didn't have the means to earn the food that they needed to eat. But to help farmers kind of make some money, one of the things that the government proposed was to encourage farmers not to produce. And you see a farmer here unloading a calf. If you look down towards the bottom of that photograph, there's a guy standing there. His face is basically not facing us, he's facing the calf, and he's got something in his hand. And I hate to say, he has a gun. What ends up happening is we had the government encouraging some farmers to destroy some of their herds, and it's kind of an unusual thing to think about. We are in a time when there were so many people that were in need of food, and yet because of the prices being so awful, the government recommended destroying some of those crops. Like dairy farmers were basically having to pour out the milk rather than send it to, the processor. Um, Sometimes you had farmers who were raising, crops like corn that would take the corn and destroy it. They would burn it like in a corn stove or so. So it certainly was kind of a crazy time, and people were doing some wild things that were recommended by the government. So, number 10, what did some farmers do to try to raise crop prices? They destroyed their crops or they tried to block deliveries to reduce the supply, with the idea that once the supply diminishes, the prices would go up. It's kind of the basic rules of economics of supply and demand. When you have too much supply, the price will drop, and if you have very little supply, the price will go up. So, needless to say, crazy ideas, and still people hurting as a result of that. Number 11, how did the effort of the Bonus Army end in 1932? And I've got to explain what the Army is. This was a group of veterans from World War One who, as a result of serving in the military, they were promised a retirement benefit that would come later on in life. And as a result of the hardships of the 30s, some of these veterans, they decided that they wanted their bonus now. And so they marched upon Washington in 1932 with the hopes of maybe getting the attention of our government and perhaps maybe getting their money back. Some of these folks came from all over the nation. What's sad is that some of them camped out, basically on the mall in Washington, some of them even camping out on the lawn of the White House. And at some point in time, our government has had enough. And they call out the U.S. Army to evict these people from these places. So in number 11, unarmed veterans were driven off from their camps by the cavalry, infantry, and tanks. You can read a little bit about the military history of guys like Douglas MacArthur or George Patton, and you might hear a little bit about how they were tied into this event where we were evicting people from the Bonus Army out of DC. So not necessarily a very pleasant time, and in a way, maybe. Causing some fear among some Americans that their government was getting a little harsh on some of the folks. And number 12, what did President Hoover expand more than any other previous president before his time? And that was the federal government's role in the economy. And yet, some people said he didn't do enough. As a result, we're going to have an election in 1932. And unfortunately for Hoover, it's not going to go well. All right. Thank you very much. We will be taking a look at notes over Chapter 19 very soon.